go.
Hello.
Hi, this is
Anna Laura.
Anna Laura. Hi, Anna Laura. She wanted to come in and say hello before I started recording and give me cuddles because she's just woken up. Love you. Well, welcome to week 6 of Going Deeper in Deuteronomy, the Gospel according to Moses. And this is our last Going Deeper for Deuteronomy. I'm then going to take a week off and we'll begin again as we look to a new series, For Heaven's Sake. We'll be looking at what the Bible has to say about heaven, and I'm sure Going Deeper will be a great format for a topic like heaven. A number of questions this week. Easy if I address the first one. Why do you look so terrible in these videos, but so good in your sermons? Well, thank you for that question. The easy answer would be because I was born this way. But the truth is, as you just saw, I record these early in the morning. I find that my brain wakes up, at least the part of my brain that thinks about the Bible, long before the rest of me wakes up. So I like to do these in the morning when I've just crawled out of bed. That's why I look terrible. Thank you. Terrific. And the second question that we had was, why did God choose Israel? So remember, last week we were talking about the fact that Israel was chosen by God because of his love for their ancestors. The simple answer is that God chose Israel because God chose Israel. Why? Because God, in the same way that Yahweh is I am that I am, God chooses whom he chooses. We established the fact that it wasn't because Israel was deserving or merited it in some way. Having thought about it a little bit more, I still think the best answer is because God chooses whom he chooses. But one of the things I was thinking about is that throughout the Bible, we see God choosing the least and the unlikely. As Paul says in the New Testament, we have this treasure in jars of clay, that through our weakness, the power of God might be made visible. And I think there's something about that with the nation Israel. Israel are an enslaved people, they're an oppressed people, they're the lowest of the low, they're the weakest of the weak. And God chooses them, of all people, to display his glory and might. Third question, and that is preempting today's discussion around Deuteronomy chapter 5 and the 10 commandments, or the 10 words. Why are there only 10? Is there a significant reason for the number 10? Is there a secret meaning around 10? What's the significance of 10 in the Bible? It's a good question. And I think it's fair to say from the outset that numbers do mean something in Israelite society, just like names do in a way that they don't for us. Okay? So I do think that there is significance around numbers. As I said last week, the number 7 is consistently used throughout the Bible to represent completeness, perfection. You get to types of literature like apocalyptic literature and Daniel and Revelation, and there's significance in numbers there. A lot of people get themselves twisted into knots trying to decode things sometimes where there's nothing to decode. So why 10 commandments? I don't think there's a particular significance for the number 10 beyond this very practical reason. I think there are 10 commandments because it is a mnemonic device. In other words, you've got 10 fingers, and the 10 words, I think there's one word for each finger. This was something that Moses had commanded the children of Israel to teach their children and to teach their children's children. This was something that was to be committed to memory. And I think a great way of memorizing something is by associating it with your fingers. So 10 commandments, 10 fingers. I also need to say I keep forgetting to do this. I did it the first week. I need to remind myself to do it each week. I am using a number of resources in my study that come together. So without a doubt, unquestionably, the number one resource is commentary notes by a Hebrew professor in Hebrew, Daniel Block. I also use Christopher Wright's commentary on Deuteronomy. I had the pleasure of meeting Chris and hosting him for a couple of talks last year. I'm sure he doesn't mind me using his commentary. And also a former lecturer of mine and friend of my sister's, Ted Woods, is his commentary as well. There are also, I look extensively, not exhaustively, but extensively across the net at different times, refer to sermons by Tim Keller, sermons by Alistair Begg, even lesser known people who I think say good things in their blogs. So I just want to share that with you. Well, let's get into it today. Chapter 5, the 10 Commandments. Hopefully you've had a chance to look at my sermon. And if you have, you'll know that it's quite provocative in points. At least there's a few ideas out there that will catch people off guard. And I want to take the time to explore that a bit more deeply. So let's begin. Okay, so chapter 5, verse 1 is the beginning of Moses' second sermon. Remember, the book of Deuteronomy really is 3 sermons from Moses and a couple of songs and a blessing or benediction at the end. This is the beginning of Moses' second sermon. And as I mentioned in the sermon, it's worth asking the question, what's the agenda here? What's the purpose of the sermon? And I think it's very practically, it's to outline for the Israelites how they are to live in covenant relationship with God. So God's invited them into relationship. He's established a covenant with them. What does it look like to live in light of that? And as I said I think a key verse of this is found in chapter 16, verse 20. Righteousness, righteousness you shall pursue. Now, many of our translations have something slightly different. They have the verse, follow justice and justice alone, so that you may live and possess the land of the Lord your God has given you. Actually, a better translation than the word justice in our Bibles is righteousness. Righteousness, righteousness, pursue righteousness alone, so that you may live and possess the land the Lord your God is giving you. We have a echo of this in chapter 6, verse 25, where it says, and if we are careful to obey all this law before the Lord our God as he has commanded us, that will be our righteousness. It will be righteousness for you if you keep the whole command that the Lord your God's given you. So what does this word righteous mean? Now, often I think it's a familiar word. It's one of those words that we hear but sometimes have trouble explaining. And I think when we hear the word righteous or righteousness, we import a New Testament understanding of that word onto the Old Testament. So for many of us, when we think of the word righteous or righteousness, we think of being right with God. So to have righteousness is to be in right relationship with God. And as Christians, perhaps you've even heard the idea of the fact that the Lord Jesus, his righteousness was imputed onto us. So that when God looks at us, he sees us as perfect. He sees the righteousness of Christ Jesus. And so we think of righteousness as being clean. That's a good understanding of the word, but it's not actually the Deuteronomy understanding of the word righteousness. So in the book of Deuteronomy, righteousness actually means behavior. It means conduct. It means actions that are in accordance with an established standard. And this occurs in Deuteronomy, occurs in other places in the Bible, even occurs outside of the Bible. For example, there's an Aramaic inscription in which a king is describing his father as a righteous man because he was loyal to his overlord. And we have to think about this in the context of what was known as a suzerain vassal covenant or contract. So righteousness in that context means behaviour established according to what was known as a suzerain vassal treaty. And I think that's what we have here in the book of Deuteronomy. Its life, its conduct as established in the treaty between God and Israel. So for Israel, this means living life in accordance with the revealed will of God. Interestingly, the word is also applied to God as well. In Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 4, in the Song of Moses, Moses declares, "Righteous and upright is he." Who's he? Well, it is the Lord. In other words, it's the Lord too also acts according to his promised commitment. So the covenant governs God and God's behaviour as much as it governs Israel and Israel's behaviour. When we think of righteousness in the life of the Israelites, I think we can break it down into roughly 4 concepts. So in the book of Deuteronomy, we have righteousness, which is to govern the Israelites' relationship with God. That's why you have no other idols. You worship God as he prescribes, as he demands. I think it governs relationship with the family. We'll see this in the Decalogue, which governs the way the head of a household treats his family. It governs relationship with a community. Deuteronomy is keen to develop a community of people who are committed to the Lord. And then righteousness also governs, or the principle governs, relationship with the environment. That might come as a surprise to you that Deuteronomy is actually concerned about nature and how the Israelites are to live in light of and respond to the land in which God has given them. For example, Deuteronomy, when it prescribes rest on the Sabbath, it prescribes rest for draft animals, for work animals. It will talk about what you should do with a bird's nest out in the field if you find it while you're harvesting, or how you're to treat an animal if you find an animal that's been abused. Righteousness covers all of these spheres of life. So righteousness governs our vertical relationships, how we relate to God. We have no other gods. We worship God the way he calls on us to worship him. Righteousness has a personal dimension. You shall not covet. All right, that's what's in our hearts, isn't it? Your mind and your heart shall remain true to the Lord. This is a personal righteousness, or behaviour personally in accordance with what God has set out. But there's also horizontal righteousness in creation care, in social justice, family care. So it's a concept that governs life within the covenant community. So our subject is the Decalogue. It's most often referred to as the 10 Commandments. But I'll be calling it the Decalogue, which is a Greek word meaning 10 words. That's a much better translation than the 10 Commandments. So Moses summons the Israelites together. "Hear, O Israel, the ordinances and the judgments that I declare in your hearing today. Learn them," that is, memorize them, be able to recite them, 10 fingers, and be sure to follow them. Moses' goal in his sermon is not to offer an intellectually stimulating lecture on the Decalogue. Moses' goal is to affect behaviour. He says, learn them and keep them by doing them. And he announces the significance of the events that happened at Horeb, or Sinai. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Israel at Horeb. And so the Decalogue that follows is the document that summarizes the establishment of that relationship. Now, Moses rhetorically transports these people back to that event. He says, the Lord made a covenant with you. You were there. Well, literally, physically, they weren't. It was their parents who were there. Some of these people standing before Moses now weren't even born. They certainly weren't assembled when the covenant was made. But Moses is a preacher. He's trying to shape people's thinking. He's trying to soften people's hearts to hear the revelation of God. So he's trying to create a covenant community. And he does so with this rhetorical device because it applies to them. It's for them as much as it was for their parents. Moses also reminds them, doesn't he, how intimate the encounter was. Their parents had a direct encounter with the Lord. He'd invited the people into his presence. And in verse 6, Moses recalls their response. He has more to say about that in verse 22, but he reminds them here of their fear in the Lord's presence. "Stop, stop," they said. "If God continues speaking like this, we're all dead." So you, Moses, you go and hear what God has to say and relay them. And this really establishes Moses as the mediator, God's spokesperson. Now he becomes the mouthpiece for God in his revelation. The Decalogue, or the Ten Commandments to most people, it might be the most familiar text in Deuteronomy. But I think it's sorely misunderstood, and the Decalogue actually presents us with a rare opportunity to observe a text in two versions. So we know, don't we, from our New Testament studies, that we've got 3 or 4 versions of the gospel. For example, we've got Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're referred to as the synoptic gospels because they give us 3 portraits of Jesus. And some of them overlap, but in other parts they're quite different. And we have within the Bible 2 versions of the Decalogue. The first is found in a narrative context in Exodus chapter 20, from verses 1 to 21, where the author of Exodus reproduces the whole Decalogue. And here Moses recites the Decalogue orally from verse 6 to 21. And whoever put this book together in its final form gives us Moses' recitation of the document. So we can look at the 2 different versions, and they're actually different in some respects. I think it's important to begin by talking about how the Bible speaks of the Decalogue. We almost always hear this as the 10 Commandments, don't we? But we should realise that the Scriptures never call them this. And I think the 10 Commandments is an unfortunate term on 2 counts. Firstly, we never use the word commandment, do we? Think about daily life. We might use the word command. Why don't we just call them the 10 Commands? But we never use the word commandment in everyday speech. Secondly, and more importantly, the Scriptures don't call these the 10 Commandments. And so I think we should call them what the Scriptures call them. And how do the Scriptures talk about this document? Well, they firstly call them the words of the Lord. Secondly, they're referred to as the 10 words. And thirdly, in one instance, they're referred to as Torah. So in Exodus 20, verse 1, Scripture calls these documents the words of Yahweh. We read, God spoke all these words. Now notice that it doesn't say God issued all these commands or God commanded all these laws. This is communication. God spoke these words. Deuteronomy picks it up in chapter 5, verse 22. These words Yahweh spoke with a loud voice to you, your whole assembly at the mountain, out of the fire, the cloud, and the thick darkness. And he added no more. So whenever we have the Scriptures referring to this covenant document, they are always the words, that is the Devarim, of the Lord. Secondly, and more specifically, whenever the First Testament or the Old Testament refers to this as a document, it's called the 10 words, not the 10 commands, the 10 words. Exodus 34:28. So Moses was there with Yahweh 40 days and 40 nights. He ate neither bread nor drank water, and he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the 10 words. In chapter 4:13 in Deuteronomy, we've already seen this. He declared to you his covenant, which he commanded you to perform, that is, the 10 words. It's the same expression. Thirdly, the document's called Torah in at least one instance. In Exodus 24 verse 12, the Lord said to Moses, "Come up to me on the mountain and wait there, that I may give you the tablets of stone with the Torah, which I've written for their instruction." So to be sure that we get the point, Torah is instruction rather than legislation. And in addition to these three ways of referring to the 10 words, there are many expressions, we won't go through them now, that use a number of covenantal terms for the document. They're called at different points the word of the covenant, the tablets of the covenant. Interestingly for me, in Exodus 31:18, these tablets are called literally the tablets of the pact. That's the New Jewish Publication Society translation of it. Tablets of the pact. So these tablets contain a summary of the covenant stipulations, how the people and the Lord are to relate to one another. Now, what's really important when we get to our text is Moses' preamble and prologue shouldn't be divorced from the words, the 10 words themselves. We see that the document begins with "I am the Lord your God" in verse 6. This introduces the covenant relationship. I am the Lord your God. But then we have a description. Who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. I think this is so important because in the ancient Near East, when you had your typical suzerain vassal treaty, that's what they were known as, they were imposed upon vassals by the suzerain, an emperor over subject kings after they'd been defeated in battle. These people who had been defeated would come cringing in homage and submission. But with this treaty, the covenant is quite different. See, the Lord didn't become Israel's suzerain, their sovereign Lord, by beating them in battle. How did the Lord become Israel's suzerain? Well, by beating Israel's enemy, by delivering them from slavery. That makes such a transformative way of looking at it, because this covenant is the outworking of grace, of liberation. This is gospel. So if you detach the fact that the Lord, their God, the one who's established the covenant, was the one who brought out of slavery, out of the house of Egypt, then what you have here is legalism. But the 10 words here are not preconditions to salvation. They're a response to the salvation that the Lord has already granted them. He's already brought them out of Egypt. This is unmerited. God rescues Israel from Egypt without any qualifications or conditions, and in response establishes them as his people and establishes the covenant between them. Now, when we read this document, I think we need to ask, who's it for? As I mentioned in the sermon, we tend to think of it as being for all Christians at all time. And I think there are certainly truths and wisdom that apply to all of us, even today. But though the Bible was written for us, it wasn't written to us. So who was it written to? Who's being addressed here? When the text says, "You shall have no other gods besides me. You shall not carry the name of the Lord your God in vain. You shall not kill. You should not steal. You should not commit adultery." The obvious question is the you. And I've mentioned this in the sermon, but I think the you here is an adult male. In fact, an adult male who has parents. Honour your father and mother. Though they could be deceased, that the command here doesn't end with the death of your parents. But this person owns fields and houses. He owns oxen and donkeys. He has adult children and servants. He's tempted to commit adultery with his neighbour's wife. Who's the you? I think the obvious conclusion is the adult male head of house. And I think we need to take a moment to let that sink in, don't we? So what's the objective then? Whose interests are being served? And I do think the answer is quite surprising, and because it's not what we expect, we might have difficulty grappling with this. This document isn't there to protect the interests of the head of the house. It actually does the opposite. The point of the text is to protect families and neighbours from an adult male who's tempted to abuse his power. In a sense, the other way of expressing this view of the Decalogue is to understand it as a Bill of Rights. And unlike a modern Bill of Rights, which are designed to protect my rights, this Bill of Rights isn't so concerned about the rights of the head of the house, particularly in a patristic society. More so, it's concerned about the rights of the ones under his authority. This is a Bill of Rights in the sense that it is designed to protect the rights of others from the abuse of the head of a house. I want to quickly see how this works out. I'm not going to give a full exposition of the 10 words, but I want to help us see how I think this functions as a Bill of Rights, as a document that serves the interest of those under authority. So let's go from one command to the next all the way through. First command, you shall have no other God besides me, which is to say, you shall not make for yourself a graven image, for I, the Lord your God, am an impassioned God. We often use the word jealous here, but impassioned is a better word. In other words, the Lord has the rights to exclusive allegiance. The head of the house is not to make another God to worship in the place of or alongside God. Second command, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Except that's not actually what the Hebrew says. We usually understand or interpret the second command as a command against profanity, against using God's name in oaths or as a swear word. I know that's how I understood it growing up. And actually that may be involved, but it's not the primary sense as I understand it. Literally, the text says, you shall not carry or bear or wear the name of the Lord your God in vain. So this text, this document assumes that every true Israelite is stamped with the name of the Lord. In other words, they've been branded by God. Isaiah 44 verse 5 and 6, he talks about the people having written on their hands belonging to Yahweh. What the sense of this is here is that Israelites are the property, if you will, of the Lord. And that wherever they go, they declare to the world that they belong to the Lord. And so they advertise to the world what their God is like. Makes sense, isn't it, when you think about the purpose of Israel being chosen by God to bear witness to the nations of who this God is. So bearing the name of the Lord means claiming Yahweh as one's God. Bearing the name falsely then means to claim this name but to live as if you belong to Baal or to some other god. You shall not take or carry or wear or bear the name of the Lord your God in vain. This is also a New Testament truth, isn't it? Peter talks about if you suffer for that name, be sure that it's not because you are ethically problematic. But if you suffer as a Christian, then that's an honour because you bear the name of Christ. We're baptised into that name. At the moment of our baptism, if you will, the Lord brands us with his name. We're called Christians. Wherever we go, we advertise the character of the God whose name that we claim. Thirdly, the Lord has the right to Israel's life and trust, according to the Exodus version. In the Exodus version, the Sabbath command, remember the Sabbath to keep it holy, because on 6 days the Lord created the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested, so you too should rest. If you look at the Exodus version, this is a divine right of God to our time and to our trust, that we're to live according to God's pattern. We trust him to take care of us on the seventh day. Interestingly, if you look at the Deuteronomy version, the Sabbath command is grounded in a completely different place. In the Deuteronomy version, Moses adds, remember the Sabbath, keep it holy, For you remember what it was like. You were slaves in Egypt, but the Lord brought you out. So keep the Sabbath. And be sure that your slaves and servants have a Sabbath, and your draft animals have a Sabbath. I can imagine the head of an Israelite household saying, well, you know what, I'm going to keep the Sabbath, but I'm going to send out my servants into the field to work the fields, and I'll take the oxen and the donkey, their draft animals. And he could say, I'm keeping the Sabbath. He focused on the letter of the law, much like the Pharisees do in the time of Jesus. But what the Deuteronomy version is saying here is that every member of the household, not just the head, has the right to humane treatment, the right to rest. This is a divine right. We have the fourth command, honor your father and your mother. Now, he's not talking to teenagers. It's good to remember that. As a teenager, I'm not sure how many times this verse was quoted. He's talking to an adult male. The head of a house, their parents have the right to respect, which means more than just verbalizing honor. It actually means, I think, caring for them in their old age. It means honoring them even after they've gone, they've passed away. It's interesting, I think, that Moses adds a reward. He declares that if you honor your father and your mother, then he adds, it may go well with you. Paul later in the New Testament picks this up and recognizes that this is the only command here with a promise. The fifth command, you shall not kill. This command recognizes that the addressee's family members and neighbors have a right to life. Sixth command, you shall not commit adultery. The addressee's neighbors have the right to a pure marriage. Seventh command, you shall not steal. That is, the addressee's neighbors have a right to their own property. Eighth command, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. This is not about everyday lying or deceit. This actually envisages a court context. The addressee's neighbors have a right to a true and honest reputation. Ninth command, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. This is the Deuteronomy version. The addressee's neighbor and the addressee's wife have the right to freedom from fear that this head of the household is going to want to take the neighbor's wife. Much like we see, if you remember back to Genesis with Abraham, pretending that Sarah was his sister, and Pharaoh wanting to take Sarah to be his. 10th command, you shall not covet your neighbor's male servant or female servant, house or field, ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. In other words, the addressee's neighbor has the right to freedom from fear of his intentions concerning property. Now, it's true, isn't it? In our day, we try to protect our property with padlocks and everything else like that. We lock the doors. When I moved to Tassie from Brunswick in Melbourne, we arrived and I asked the people that we bought the house from came over to do a bit of a handover, and I noticed that the letterbox was unlocked. And so I asked the previous owner where the keys were for the letterbox, and he just burst out laughing. He couldn't believe that I'd asked him. We don't lock our letterboxes. Nobody does. Sure enough, he's right. So yes, if you ever get a hankering for mail, our letterbox is unlocked. But I should let you know that our next door neighbours on the right is a traffic authority, and on the left is a policeman. So make sure you pick the right house. So let me just summarise this. There are only 10 words. The Decalogue is not interested in being an exhaustive document. As mentioned in the sermon, there are very important aspects of Israelite life that are not covered here, but this, I think, does represent a sample of areas of everyday life where your covenant commitment to the Lord should govern how you live. It should play the decisive role in determining your actions and behaviour and conduct. I think the intention is to give us a worldview, that if you live by that, these values that are represented in the Decalogue, you'll be a righteous person. That is, you will live in light of your behaviour, and conduct will be right in light of the agreement, the covenant that the Lord's made with you. Look, I think Jesus comes and blows this up into an even into another dimension. When you look for a worldview, one of the most influential books I read as a late teen, into my early 20s was Chuck Colson's. Chuck Colson was a former politician in the Nixon regime in the States who went to prison and was converted. And he wrote a book, How Now Shall We Live? And in that book he gives a worldview, a Christian worldview. This is what it looks like to live life in the context of being born again as a disciple of Jesus, as a follower of Christ, as a child of God. I think when Jesus comes and begins his ministry, he does something similar in Matthew 5 and the Sermon of the Mount. And the Beatitudes, if you will, are a summary statement, 14 verses at the beginning of chapter 5, that summarize his whole sermon through the end of chapter 7 of what it looks like to live as kingdom people. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, he begins. And you read that, and I think that presents a worldview, presents, if you will, a summary of a covenant of what it looks like for us to live in right relationship with God. And it addresses how we're to live in this world. This is the ethic of Jesus. How to live life well. In a sense, it gives us an insight into what the Decalogue is trying to do here with the people of Israel. And fundamental to that is the family as the building, or the household as the building block to society. And the Decalogue, I think, is seeking to create a domestic environment where the head of the house serves those who are in his charge, where he's responsible and compassionate as a husband, as a father, as an employer. In other words, the head of the house carries the household on his shoulders. And I do think that the key to all of this is love. We mentioned in Going Deeper last week, in Hebrew, the word arav means love. It's a covenant commitment demonstrated in action in the interest of the other person. That's love. It's the key, I think, to Deuteronomy 5. It's key to the whole book of Deuteronomy. It's key to the instructions of holiness that you'll see in Leviticus. If you ever read Leviticus from chapter 17 through to about 26, this is the key to Deuteronomy, love. This is love, that I'm willing to sacrifice myself for my neighbours, my family members, for the Lord. And this changes how we live, doesn't it? Changes how we live as Christians. When we grasp the love and grace of God for us, and we don't live our lives fearful of missing the mark. We recognise we've already missed the mark, and God, in his great love for us and his great grace towards us, has purchased us, redeemed us for himself. And so we live in light of that, and it's so freeing. But I think it's also transformative, because we then show that same love to others. You and I, we are branded, if you will, with the name of Christ Jesus. And as we walk in our workplaces and in the supermarket, and as we engage with people, we carry that name with us. And so we're to live as people who have been redeemed, to live in the freedom of that, and to offer that same grace and love to others. And I think that is transformative. I think that's how you and I as Christians show the glory of God, point others to Christ, that people might see our good deeds, see the way in which we live, see the way in which we treat others with kindness and gentleness and compassion, see our concern for the oppressed, and see our concern for the enslaved, the abused, the homeless, and how we respond to those needs, our care for the world, and through our lives then ask the bigger question: surely there must be a God. Who is this God the King of Glory. Well, friends, I hope you've gleaned something from that. And let me encourage you to keep thinking. And you've got a couple of weeks now to reflect on Deuteronomy. I'm curious, I'm going to put this out there. How has our study of the book of Deuteronomy, how has God used that to shape how you think and live? If you don't have an answer to that question yet, maybe you need to do some more thinking. But I'd love to hear and share stories of how God has graciously opened our eyes to his great grace through the gospel according to Moses. And I'd love to hear what difference that's made for you, indeed as it has for me. So take care. I'll see you in a couple of weeks' time when we begin our next series, For Heaven's Sake. Bye.